thyroid bone. And I have a little plastic copy of it here. This is a bone that does not connect to any other bone in the body. It is suspended just below the jaw by muscles from the mandible and muscles coming from the sternum or the voice box. So you can see part of it right here. Okay. And so muscles that attach to that have the word hyoid in their name. So when we get to that unit, geniohyoid from the mandible, stylohyoid from the styloid process. And so this essentially has two functions. Its normal function is to pull the voice box up with these muscles so that the cover for the voice box keeps food from going down your airway. But when the voice box and larynx are held stable, then this is the muscles attached to that will pull your jaw down. All right. So the entire muscle is a site of muscle attachment, but not a joint surface, because it doesn't contact any other tissue but muscle tissue and ligaments. All right, so now we're going to move to vertebrae. So why don't you come over? There's probably enough of the strung vertebra for about 3 or 4 per table. And then grab, if you don't have access to a vertebra, you can grab your own separate sacrum or just go vertebral bones here. I want you to be able to see the characteristics of these vertebrae. Talk about them.
Do we need the carpet or not?
If you have the carpet there, it's okay because these are still real bones, but they're not as fragile as the skull. So it's kind of up to you.
Skull in here. Yeah, no, that's mine. Oh wait,
Oh, did you?
because it has more detail in
Yes.
carpet again?
If you put on your book, it's okay. Probably, yeah, go ahead and use carpet because they are real bones, so I hate for them to get chipped. They're not as likely to be dropped as the skull,
There's
but
just no cost. Can we move this? I don't want this right here. Put it under my thing. No, it's just, that's where I write. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
okay, so let's do some review questions before we actually get into the vertebra. So, unfortunately, your lab exam is not multiple choice, but your very last one is. Your muscle one will be like this, multiple choice. Okay. So, what bone is this arrow pointing to?
Zygomatic.
Zygomatic. Is this a right eye or a left eye orbit?
Right.
Right. Good. And what would this little bone right here be? Remember that tiny, we have 6 bones, and then the 7th one is the tiny, tiny one. No, ethmoid is this light blue here.
Oh, the midline.
So frontal, zygomatic, sphenoid's the yellow one, maxillary, lacrimal, ethmoid, starts with a P. Forms the posterior aspect of the roof of your mouth. Palatine, there you go. Yeah, palatine bone. All right. What is this bone?
Oh, that bat one?
Yes, the bat one. Not a baseball bat. Sphenoid. Okay, and so this would be what process then? The only one up here that belongs to the sphenoid bone. All the others belong to the temporal bone.
Styloid?
Pterygoid. So zygomatic process is the temporal bone. Styloid process is the temporal bone. Mastoid process is the temporal bone. Pterygoid plate or pterygoid process is from the sphenoid. Okay. So the gray structured bone here is the ethmoid bone. What would this process right here be? Superior nasal concha. Okay. So here's the inferior, which is a different color because it's a different bone. This is middle. Remember I said the superior one you couldn't see when you looked through the nose? Because it's hidden by the middle. And the perpendicular plate is absent. That's why we can see it in the sagittal cut, because the perpendicular plate is gone. Okay. What sinus would this be? Sphenoid sinus. Here's the solitary sigmoid. Here's the pterygoid plate that we were just looking at the this is the palatal bone here, which is how it contributes up here to the orbit. All right. What opening is right here? Rotundum. Okay. And what passes through foramen rotundum? I know it's only been 12 hours. Trigeminal, first, second, or third branch? Second. Because first is coming through the superior orbital fissure, and third is coming through here. Okay? All right, so you don't want to put you through too much stress. Just make sure your brains are up and running. The warm-up. So the vertebral column creates support for two aspects. It helps muscles and ligaments keep the bones attached to each other, and that allows you to have an erect back. Most of us have an erect back. And then if you look in an individual vertebra, you can see this opening right here, which is called the vertebral foramen or vertebral canal. And when we stack them all up, that creates the dorsal cavity. Remember our dorsal cavities, we have the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. And so this is a bony protection for your spinal cord. And that diameter will change depending on where we are along the vertebral column, because the spinal cord changes in diameter depending on how many sensory or motor fibers are going to be found within it. Now the spinal cord itself, as you'll see in our next unit, actually we're talking the cellular and fiber material of the spinal cord stops right about this level. But our vertebral canal continues all the way down and is even found within the sacrum. And that's because we still have spinal nerves that are exiting. I was looking for this morning and couldn't find it in back here. So spinal nerves are still exiting the spinal cord all the way down through to the sacrum. Told you I was tired. So even though the spinal cord stops here, those nerves continue to go down to exit at their proper level to move to the proper area of the body. All right. So let's take a look at a typical vertebra. It's actually a thoracic vertebra. And so this is looking at the superior surface. This is a lumbar vertebra, so looking at it in this view. And then I'll also draw it from a lateral view. Okay? In fact, I'm going to draw the lateral. Let me draw the lateral view first because I think that makes more sense. So the thickest part of the vertebra is identified as the body. And the spinal cord is found posterior to that. So when we look in a posterior abdominal or thoracic wall, we actually see a large round column bulging into the thoracic or abdominal cavity created by this body. I'll start this over here. It's mostly cancellous bone, spongy bone, which is a thin shelf of compact bone over it. And there is a process extending upward and a process extending downward. And if you look especially at your articulated vertebra, you can see these processes catch on each other. So this process has an it's called the superior articulating process, and it has a cartilaginous surface here. And this one has a cartilaginous surface here. So what I've diagrammed is this structure here and this structure here. And they catch. All right? So the inferior articulating surface of one vertebra will catch on the superior articulating surface of the vertebra below it. And that helps to create an interlocking joint between those two vertebrae, keep them from sliding in forwards and backwards. So this is identified as the superior articulating process, and it has the word for joint in its name, so it's obviously a joint process. And then the cartilage smooth surface is just the superior articulating facet. That's the joint surface. not going to be that picky, but you have this on one of the study diagrams in your lab. And that's the difference. One's the joint surface itself, and the other's a bony process that contains that. And this would be the inferior. Articulating process and facet. Okay. For the body, this is also a joint surface. All right? Because between the two bodies of the vertebra, we have fibrocartilage. And we'll come back and talk about this as a joint when we're done with vertebra. So this is the intervertebral disc. And now when we put those two vertebrae together, the notch, the top and the notch at the bottom, creates an opening. Okay? So you can identify this as the intervertebral notch, or the two together, an intervertebral foramen. And again, I'm not going to be picky. If I show you one and you call it a foramen instead of a notch, that's fine. Okay, because the purpose of it is to create an opening for those spinal nerves. So here's one notch, here's the other. If we had this in a vertebra down here, it would complete the opening. All right? So intervertebral notch or foramina. And again, there's one at the bottom. Okay. Then coming from the just posterior to the body, there's a lateral process that's coming out at you kind of at this angle. And when I show the top view, that will be a little bit clearer. And this is known as the transverse process. So even though I'm not going to draw it just yet, I'll go back to this view so you can see how it's coming out here at an angle like that. That's the transverse process. Okay. Yes. And it would do it on the other side. And then we have a elongated posterior process known as the spinous process. So that's from the lateral view. And there are some additional structures we can see here that are a little easier to see from the superior view. So the body. Here's the vertebral canal. All right. I never tag that. I will tag its parts, but I will never tag that because it's just hard to tag. In the sense that to tag it, I have to tag what's attached to it. So here's what I mean. Here's a transverse process. So the two walls between the body and the transverse process are known as the pedicles, which means foot, like pedestrian or pedometer. So I'm tagging the pedicle here, not the vertebral canal. Okay? And then this structure, that was a little off. This structure is identified as the lamina, from the same root as lamella, when we're talking about the layers of bone tissue. So pedicle and lamina, two pedicles, two lamina. Right?
They look the same. What's different about them?
The pedicle is forming this area here that's attached to the body.
Okay.
The two lamina come together to form the spinous process. All right, so if I were to tag it on here, it's a little more difficult. But this area right here would be the pedicle. So if you have an individual vertebra, you can separate it on the articulated ones. Here's the body, and then this portion right here is the pedicle, whereas this portion right here is the lamina. So anterior to the transverse process would be pedicle, posterior to the transverse process would be lamina. Okay. So the lamina, I think it's easier to see on the right-hand diagram, but the lamina would be kind of that area.
And then together, they're all the.
Together they form the arch. Okay. So this would be lamina, and this would be pedicle. Right? And these are processes of muscle attachment. Ligaments hold the bones together too, but they're primarily processes of muscle attachment, and we'll look at the ligaments at the end. Now, remember I said lamina in reference to the layer of bone? So if you have a piece of paper, a photograph, or a miniature of your high school diploma that you want to keep from getting torn and you laminate it, you put it between two layers of plastic. So the way in which the spinous process is formed in the embryo is through fusion. So remember when I gave you the for free lecture about mesoderm and endoderm and ectoderm? And we talked about how the embryonic disc, we looked at it in this view, had a furrow, and that furrow fused, and this became the hollow tube that runs down the spinal cord and into your brain. Well, this starts to fuse about right here in the middle and moves that way and that way, and it's last to close in the lumbar region. If it doesn't close, then as the embryo develops in that region, the spinal cord is open to the surface of the body, spina bifida. Okay, that's the most severe case, is when babies will be born paralyzed in their lower limbs with a large membrane-bound sac of nerves that are just all tangled up because they did not grow down into the lower extremities. My mother's sister, when she was about a year and a half, died of an infection of that neural tissue. She was born with spina bifida. Right? Now, that spina bifida, where it's actually seen, spina bifida where it's hidden, this actually closes. All right, and the neural tube closes, and the spinal cord develops normally, but the spinous processes do not close. And so you'll have a normal spinal cord, but you'll have two incomplete lamina that never fused. So normal neurological function, and that's often not detected unless they have an X-ray or an MRI. Okay. That's because of its embryonic origin is to fuse, and if it doesn't fuse, they stay separate like that. All right, so on the diagram here, this is again of a thoracic vertebra, and so here would be the pedicle on each side, and here between the body and the transverse process. I always remembered it as the foot that was attached to the body. All right, and then the lamina, you laminate them together and get the spinous process. Here you can see joint surfaces on the superior articulating surface, and over here as well on the transverse process and on the body. What do you think these joint surfaces are for? Remember I said, though, this is called a typical vertebra, it's actually a thoracic. Ribs. Yeah, so the rib is going to attach like this and curve around to the front. And so that's one of the unique characteristics that we see for thoracic vertebrae. These, what I've labeled on the board, we see on all of our vertebrae. Okay? And so now I'm going to go through, we have 5 different types of vertebrae. In the neck region, they're called the cervical, chest, thoracic, back, lumbar, sacral, between the coccyx, this is sacrum right here, and then we have a little rattlesnake tail bones, the coccyx. Okay. So we're going to go through those and describe the unique characteristics. So if I had just a bone by itself out there, you would be able to tell me what group it belonged to. I'm not going to ask if it's the second lumbar or the third lumbar. I couldn't even tell you that. If you were to take physical anthropology, you would learn that, okay? But I can tell you what group they belong to and whether it's an early one or a late one, but not the actual number. So I'm not going to ask you to do that. Never ask you to do something I can't do. All right. So cervical vertebra, there are typically 7. Some individuals will have more. They'll have an 8th one, rarely a 9th. But there are typically 7, and we've already talked about the first one. That one articulates with the occipital condyle of the skull and forms, so you can see it on this model right here. Notice this one doesn't appear to have a spinous process, but it has a very large superior articulating process, and it's a large oval one. So I'm going to pass around. There might be two. I didn't get all those back. Are there some bones out there that look like this out on the tables? I passed out about 6 or 7 this morning. Let me put them back over here. Oh dear. Okay. So these are the first cervical vertebra, and the larger oval area is going to be superior. Notice it doesn't have a body, and it doesn't have much of a spinous process. So instead, those are called, you don't have to know these, but they're called tubercles, all right? So looking at this, is there anything that you see that you don't see on the vertebra of your articulated columns farther down? So you have this first cervical one. If you have a completely articulated skeleton, vertebral column, this is the very first one up here. What do you see in these first 7 vertebrae that you don't see in the ones below? Even if you don't know the name of it, you can describe it. Yes. The holes in the transverse processes. That is found only in cervical vertebrae. You can see right here, there's an opening in the transverse process. Here's an opening in the transverse process. And that is the most easily determined characteristic of cervical vertebrae. I'm going to keep this diagram up here because I need it for my thoracic one. But cervical vertebrae demonstrate, well, possess transverse foramina. As soon as you see that, you will know that that is a cervical vertebra. None of the other types will have transverse foramen. The purpose for that is for the transmission of blood vessels and nerves. So see, this is the carotid artery. It's an internal carotid artery. Later in lab, you can look in here and see it come through the carotid canal. But you can see right here on this side how it's traveling up through the side of the neck. Here the nerves are traveling up through those openings, but I want you to recall that the transverse foramen is for the transmission of the vertebral arteries, vessels, and nerves. So they're called vertebral for their position. And this is the other major source of blood supply to the brain. What was the vessel we learned on yesterday? Or maybe Tuesday that carried blood to the brain?
Oh, that one.
Yes. You can see it coming out right there. Jeff put in a nice piece of plexiglass here to keep this from. So if you take a look at this during lab, I don't know if you can see it on your camera, but you can see 2 large vessels coming out of the center of the skull. Those are the internal carotid arteries coming through the carotid canal. Trigeminal is the nerve.
Oh.
So this is the carotid arteries, all right? The only other blood vessels to carry blood to the brain are the vertebral arteries, the ones that pass up through the vertebral, the transverse foramen. They enter the skull through the foramen magnum, where we find the spinal cord. Okay? And so these openings in the transverse processes provide a bony protection for those muscles as they travel up the neck. I was teaching the upper division class at Sac State, and the students had to do case studies, but they had to do presentations. And this particular presentation, and they had to do audio-visual. This particular presentation was the anatomy of a hanging. And so to describe the neck anatomy of the cervical vertebra, they brought in stacks of 7 large pretzels. And in the twist of the pretzel, that was the transverse foramen. And then they gave each of us a fat stick of mozzarella cheese and red vines. And the red vines were the vertebral arteries to put up the transverse foramen, and the stack of mozzarella was the spinal cord that went in the center. And that was their illustration of the cervical neck anatomy. Okay? But the cervical vertebrae are the only ones to demonstrate those. Now we have 2 special cervical vertebrae. What I just handed out is the first one, and it has a special name of the atlas. So for lab, you can either identify that as the atlas or the first cervical vertebra. Either one is fine. This superior articulating surface, if you have one on your articulated skull or in your hand, it's the larger oval articulating surface. What process is that going to articulate with in the skull? Occipital condyle. Okay? You can say occipital condyle or condylar process of the occipital bone. And one's a bit shorter. Or you can, for the mandible, you can say mandibular condyle or condylar process of the mandible. So the occipital condyle is going to fit in that superior articulating facet and rock back and forth as you move your head back and forth like this. Okay? It's called the atlas because it holds up the world, which is your skull. The second cervical vertebra, you also need to be able to identify as either the axes or the second cervical vertebra. And this one has the body that used to develop as part of the first cervical vertebra but did not stay there, dropped down and fused to the second. So this is known as the dens or odontoid process. That's characteristic of the second. It creates the rotational joint. So when you turn your head from side to side, the skull and the first vertebra move together. So here's the first cervical vertebra, and it's going to rotate like this. And the skull rotates with it. So as one piece, they rotate around that dens when you do this. Dens means tooth, and it always reminds me a little bit of a little tooth that chicks are born with so they can poke through the shell. So that's what where that word comes from. Okay? Anybody not have a vertebra or want to see a separate copy? Because it's the second vertebra of your chain. I'll put them over here if you want to take a look at them later. You won't have your own articulated vertebral column. Now, on this one, you can see another characteristic that's present on 5 of the 7. Okay, do you see something else up on here? Look at the ones that are on your own vertebral column. What do you see that's present on a few? It's not present on the first one, and it's not present on the last cervical vertebra. See how this doesn't quite fuse? So on cervical vertebra 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they have this bifid spinous process where the 2 lamina didn't completely fuse. Bifid, same word for bifida, spinous process. And then finally, the third unique cervical vertebra is number 7. So we had a special name for number 1, the atlas, special name for number 2, the axes, and number 7 is has a long process. So on this diagram, you can see that this bifid spinous process is found here in the axis, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th The seventh one does not have a bifid, but its spinous process sticks out farther than any other. So if you put your hand at the base of your neck, most of you will be able to feel a bump right there. That's your seventh cervical vertebra. And it's called the vertebral prominence, or the prominent vertebra. And it's because its spinous process extends out so far. So the entire vertebra is a vertebral prominence. Okay. Now just in general, not something that shows up as clearly with a single vertebra, is the pattern. Notice how horizontal these spinous processes are? When we compare that to the thoracic spinous processes, these are much more vertical and overlapping. So they're like shingles. So, not that I recommend it. Shoot, you have me on recording. Oh well, I guess I'll go through with it. If you were to go after somebody with an ice pick, you're much more likely to get to their spinal cord between the spinous processes of the cervical vertebra than you are the thoracic, because of that overlapping protection. Okay? Whereas so in thoracic it's like this, in cervical it's like that. That's a little easier to get between them. All right. But I didn't recommend it to anybody. Okay? I'm not saying go try this out.
You're saying we shouldn't do that.
Correct. Okay, so now let's look at thoracic. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Notice how the bodies are getting bigger, getting thicker because they're supporting more weight. In addition, thoracic vertebrae have 6 more additional articulating surfaces. We go back to the original, let's see if I have it here. No, the original typical vertebra picture was better to demonstrate that. So 6 additional articulating surfaces. I can't draw all of them on the board because they're going to be on the 3 of them are going to be on the other side. But there's one here, and one here. What do you think those are for?